במלחמה. אגו, מותר לך. אגו, מותר לך.
Conceived in the early 1930s as a high-performance executive passenger plane, the prototype for the Bristol Blenheim was presented to the nation by its champion, the first Lord Rothermere. This revolutionary monoplane design heralded the end of the biplane era, and when it entered service in 1937, it was the fastest and most advanced aircraft in the RAF. 2 years later, more than 1,000 were in service, and by the outbreak of war, the Blenheim outnumbered every other type of RAF aircraft. As a mainstay of Britain's offensive aerial power, this twin-engined machine was destined to bear the brunt of much of the early fighting. But with aviation technology advancing at breakneck speed, it was soon to be outgunned and outperformed by Germany's new frontline fighters. Blenheim losses in the first 2 years of war were simply appalling. Often sent on operations for which their machines were unsuited, the Blenheim and battle crews in France suffered the highest casualty rate of all RAF aircrews serving on any type of aircraft in World War II. But to avoid the risk of damage to the nation's morale, Britain's wartime propaganda was focused on the more glamorous single-seat fighters, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. So the Blenheim's contribution to the Allied cause was unjustly overshadowed, and in terms of air history, it became largely forgotten. But the aircraft inspired fierce crew loyalty. It played its part faithfully as a fighter and a bomber by day and by night. And by the end of hostilities, the achievements of this elegant machine were many and distinguished. It was the first British aircraft to cross the German frontier in the Second World War, and made the first attack on a German warship, the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer. It was the first aircraft to take part in an offensive aerial action, and the first to carry out a night intruder sortie. It pioneered the development of airborne radar, and carried out the first ever successful radar interception at night. It was the first aircraft to sink a U-boat, and went on to be the only RAF aircraft to serve on every front in every RAF command. And as for the crews, the Blenheim boys, their bravery was unmatched. Time after time, they pressed home attacks against odds that were virtually suicidal. The Victoria Cross was awarded to more Blenheim pilots than to Spitfire and Hurricane pilots put together. In 1933, the Bristol Aeroplane Company announced plans for the Bristol Type 135, a high-speed monoplane aircraft capable of carrying up to 8 passengers. Construction was to be an all-metal, stressed-skin fuselage, powered by 2 Bristol Aquila 500-horsepower air-cooled radial engines. Planning progressed, and by 1934, a full-size mock-up was ready for display at the Paris Salon de l'Aéronautique, scheduled for the following year. Meanwhile, Lord Rothermere, owner of the Daily Mail newspaper, had been keeping his eye on his great rival and owner of the Daily Express, Lord Beaverbrook. As a means of rapid transport for business executives, Beaverbrook had just ordered the latest American light airliner, the Lockheed 14. In response, Rothermere decided to procure an all-British aircraft, capable of establishing a European network of non-stop flights between all the major cities. With an estimated top speed of 180 miles per hour, the Type 135 seemed the ideal machine, but its range was not enough.
He approached the British aviation industry to commission an executive rapid transport to link all the capitals of Europe, and Bristol's were chosen to do the job, and they created an aircraft called the Type 142, which Rothermere personally commissioned and paid for. And when it was tested, it was found to be 50 miles an hour faster than the RAF's frontline fighters. And of course, this caused an absolute sensation.
With a modified fuselage layout, the new machine was given two 650 horsepower Bristol Mercury 6 engines in place of the smaller Aquila power plants. Takeoff and landing runs were dramatically shortened by the addition of trailing edge flaps to the wings, and pilot visibility was increased by fitting perspex panels to the nose. The backward retracting legs of the main undercarriage fitted neatly into the engine nacelles, and the addition of streamlined undercarriage doors greatly reduced wind drag. By the time the prototype made its maiden flight on April the 12th, 1935, the maximum speed of the Type 142 had increased to over 300 miles per hour. Its performance caused a sensation, and not surprisingly, for it was 50 miles per hour faster than the RAF's newest frontline fighter, the Gloucester Gladiator, and 100 miles per hour faster than its contemporary interceptor, the Hawker Fury. The Air Ministry were quick to respond and approached Lord Rothermere, asking him to loan them the Type 142 for evaluation and trials. Having been Secretary of State for Air in the days of Trenchard and the Royal Flying Corps, Rothermere had headed the very first Air Ministry between 1917 and 1918. He was fervently patriotic and had already recognized the military potential of the Type 142. After giving the new aircraft the appropriate name of Britain First, he donated the prototype 142 to the Royal Air Force. It was delivered to the research establishment at Martlesham Heath in June 1935. Bearing the military serial K7557, Britain First began flight testing and once again achieved the same startling performance figures. With a maximum speed of 307 miles per hour, it could maintain 285 miles per hour even when fully loaded. Before the formation of Fighter Command in 1936, the Air Chiefs had insisted that massive retaliation would be the only effective defense against German bombers. So, with the emphasis placed heavily on the production of bombers, the Air Ministry began discussions with Bristol to adapt the 142 to a bombing role. In August 1935, they issued specification number B2835, calling for the conversion of Type 142 to a light bomber with a crew of 3. The project was designated the Bristol Type 142M for military. A month after issuing the specification, the Air Ministry ordered 150 machines straight off the drawing board. This new military version was to be called the Blenheim Mark I. Modification of the 142 began in earnest. To allow room for an internal bomb bay, it was necessary to raise the wing from the low to mid position. The tailplane was raised and its span increased. As on Britain First, the 4-blade fixed-pitch propellers were replaced by Hamilton triple-blade variable pitch units. The airframe was strengthened to cope with the extra weight of the bombs, and the fixed tail wheel replaced by a retractable version. To make room for a bomb aimer, the cockpit was widened and more perspex added to the forward area, giving the conservatory nose a more angular look.
We had some guns which would fire backwards and downwards, but they were meant mainly for strafing and possibly chasing the odd fighter, I suppose. But we never used them very much. Well, I didn't. Nobody really did. But you're quite right, we had nothing underneath at all. The turret, of course, would swing 180 degrees, and it would tilt. I can't remember now the technical details, how many degrees down it would go. Couldn't shoot your tail off. It had a thing which prevented it from doing that. The gunners, of course, were pretty conversant, and they were all pretty skilled chaps.
In spite of its speed, the Blenheim Mark I was at best poorly armed. At worst, it was virtually defenseless. The prototype was delivered to Martlesham Heath and made its maiden flight on June the 25th, 1936. More tests followed, and after replacing the original engines with 840 horsepower Mercury 8s, the heavier military version achieved a maximum speed only slightly slower than the prototype 142. The Air Ministry ordered full-scale production, and in November 1936, the first production Blenheim Mark I left the Bristol factory. The first squadron to take delivery in March 1937 was 114 Squadron based at Whitton. Unfortunately, the first machine overturned in a landing accident and was completely destroyed. By the summer, 114 was fully re-equipped, and their Blenheims appeared at the RAF's official 1937 air display at Hendon.
It was, and first it was at the Hendon Air Show, I think I'm taking a guess now, about 37, 38. And it was a dummy attack was made on it. He did a dummy attack on the airfield and dummy attacks on the Blenheim by Hawker Hines, and they couldn't catch it. And it was billed at that time as the fastest military aircraft in the war. Well, it was.
In the next 18 months, another 16 home bomber squadrons followed, and in January 1938, the first Overseas Bomber Squadron, number 30, based in Iraq, took delivery of the Mark I. These machines carried a crew of 3, a pilot, an observer who doubled as a navigator and bomb aimer, and a wireless operator, air gunner. In terms of speed and complexity, the Blenheim represented an enormous leap forward over its biplane predecessors, such as the Hawker Hind and Hawker Demon. With wing flaps, a retractable undercarriage, and variable pitch propellers to master, service pilots found it very difficult converting to the Blenheim. Flying accidents were frequent, and by the outbreak of war, the RAF had lost 10% of the Blenheims in service. Several fatal accidents occurred among squadrons making the transition.
I wouldn't like to say the number, but I saw quite a few. I saw one take off one out in the office at Bicester, and it took off the aerodrome and went straight up. He'd had his tail trim around like that and crashed right next to the fire engine. I jumped out the window, but that was just took off in a hurry and forgot his tail trim.
But although it was a faster machine, it lacked the longer range and bigger bomb carrying capacity of the RAF's other twin-engine bombers, the Whitley, Hampden and Wellington. These statistics put the Blenheim firmly in the light bomber class and made certain it would be destined for a wide variety of roles. In December 1938, the Blenheim Mark I-F entered service as a long-range fighter variant. Visually, it was almost identical to the bomber, but it was fitted with a special pod mounted underneath the fuselage in the bomb bay position. The pod, or gun pack, contained 4 303 Browning machine guns in a fixed forward-firing arrangement. This new configuration had no adverse effect on performance. Even with 2,000 rounds of ammunition for the Brownings, the extra armament still weighed less than the normal bomb load. Some 200 Mark I's were modified to the fighter variant, using conversion kits supplied by Southern Railway's Ashford factory. These machines were eventually allocated to no less than 20 home fighter squadrons, 6 coastal command squadrons, and another 4 overseas fighter squadrons. When the Battle of Britain began, less than 18 months later, 6 full Blenheim fighter squadrons would be on the strength of fighter command. But well before the outbreak of war, research had already begun to perfect a radar set small enough to be installed in a fast twin-engined aircraft. With the aim of defending Britain against the Luftwaffe's bombers, the RAF planned to develop a force of airborne interception aircraft capable of operating at night. Since the Blenheim was the only machine available with enough space to take the new set, as well as its operator, the Mark I fighter variant was selected for the role of night fighter.
Well, the only radar installed in the Blenheim was the first elementary airborne interception radar for the night fighter. No radar of any sort in the day bombers or the other roles. But I believe I'm right in saying that the very first airborne interception radar was operationally tried out in the Blenheim Mark I. And then, of course, it developed, and all night fighters eventually had airborne radar.
Meanwhile, attempts were being made to develop a photo reconnaissance version of the Blenheim. But after building a prototype PR Mark I, the maximum speed was found to be too low for an unarmed aircraft. In 1938, production of the Mark I began to be superseded by production of a new version of the Blenheim, the Mark IV. Given the maker's designation type 142L for long range, The Mark IV was fitted with the more powerful Bristol Mercury 15 engines, each developing 920 horsepower. Wingspan and height remained the same as for the Mark I, but the nose was stretched by another 3 feet, giving an overall length of 42 feet 7 inches. The new machine became known as the long-nosed Blenheim.
There were two types of Blenheims, known as the short nose and the long nose. The short nose was used in the early days as a night fighter. There were only, I think, 10 squadrons of long nose in being when the war started. They lengthened the nose of the aeroplane so that for higher level visual bombing, the observer could go into the nose, have his bomb sight in the front, and do the visual bombing through a bomb sight.
A plotting table was sited on the port side of the navigator's cockpit, while his bomb-aiming equipment was fitted to the starboard side. Due to obstruction of the pilot's view on takeoff and landing, and to problems with reflections from the perspex glazing of the longer nose, the separate navigator's canopy was lowered and given an inward curve on the pilot's side. This new sculptured nose became the most distinctive feature of the Mark IV. Although the more powerful engines gave the Mark IV a maximum speed of 265 miles per hour at 11,800 feet, it was only slightly faster than the Mark I, which was able to achieve a top speed of 240 miles per hour at sea level. Mainly due to an increase in all-up weight and a 320-pound increase in bomb-carrying capacity, the Mark IV's service ceiling of 22,000 feet was lower than the Mark I's. But the new Blenheim did have two main advantages in performance over the Mark I. The addition of outer wing tanks meant that its range was increased by 350 miles and its endurance by 3 hours. The first squadron to equip with the Mark IV was 90 Squadron in March 1939. Following tests on some of the early production models, a number of improvements were added at a later stage. Armor plate and self-sealing tanks were fitted, and twin 303 Brownings were installed in the dorsal turret instead of a single Vickers K machine gun fitted to the Mark I. In addition to the original forward-firing gun, a remote-controlled rear-firing gun position was added in a blister beneath the nose. As on the Mark I, a gun pack was used to modify the machine to a fighter variant. Once again, Avro and Roots had been brought in as subcontractors, and this time, Bristol's Filton factory built only 10% of the total production run of 3,297 Mark IVs. Avro produced 755 of the British-built machines, while Roots manufactured the lion's share with over 2,000 airframes rolling off their production line at Speke near Liverpool. As a backup to UK production, liable to be interrupted by German bombing, over 1,000 Mark IVs were built in Canada. Manufactured under license by Fairchild Aircraft Limited, the Canadian version was designated the Bolingbroke. Although the Mark IV was easily the most numerous Blenheim produced, its airframe formed the basis of a third and final model, the Mark V. It was to be the last member of the Blenheim family to enter service. On September the 3rd, 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. A few hours later, a Blenheim Mark IV from 139 Squadron took off on a reconnaissance mission to Wilhelmshaven, and N6215 made history as the first British aircraft across the German frontier in the Second World War. The next day, 10 Blenheims from Wattisham made the first Bomber Command bombing raid of the war, when they attacked the German fleet in the Schillig Roads. Main target for the raid was the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, but it was broad daylight and the German flak was heavy. The Blenheims pressed home their attacks, but the 500-pound delayed action bombs failed to explode and bounced harmlessly off the heavily armored decks. One bomber crashed into the cruiser Emden, and another 4 failed to return. With 50% losses, the raid was an ominous sign of things to come. 2 Blenheim squadrons had already flown to France to join the ferry battles of the Advanced Air Striking Force. And 4 more squadrons joined the air component assigned to provide direct support to the British Expeditionary Force. With not enough range to reach targets deep into Germany, 2 groups Blenheims concentrated on German shipping instead. Overall, their attacks bore little fruit, but on the 11th of March, they scored a major success. P-4852, a Mark IV Blenheim, bombed and sank U-31 in the Schillig Roads. It was the RAF's first unaided U-boat kill of the war. On the 10th of May, 1940, Hitler began the invasion of France and the Low Countries. And as the Germans outflanked the Maginot Line, the BEF moved into Belgium. With Fighter Command called upon to provide extra support, 6 Blenheim Mark IVs from 600 City of London Squadron attempted to shoot up the German-occupied airfield at Walhaven. Bounced by 12 Messerschmitt 110 fighters, 5 of the Blenheims failed to return. During the battle for France, Blenheim losses in daylight attacks rose to a staggering level. In the space of 6 short days during May, 114 Squadron lost most of its aircraft, and 139 Squadron lost 7 out of 9. 15 and 110 Squadrons both suffered 50% losses, and 11 out of 12 Blenheims from 82 Squadron were shot down. In 3 days, the number of RAF bombers in France had fallen from 135 to 72. On the 14th of May alone, 40 Blenheims and battles had been lost out of a force of 71. The use of light bombers on daylight operations with little or no fighter escort had proved disastrous. Although it was capable of outperforming the old biplane fighters of 1935, by 1940, the monoplane fighter had come into service, and the Blenheim was hopelessly outclassed. When attacking targets, such as bridges and armored columns, the Blenheims and the battles were met by hails of gunfire and swarms of German fighters. With inadequate armor plating, a desperately weak defensive armament, and no fighter escort, they were shot out of the sky in squadrons. Paul Ritchie, a fighter pilot serving with No. 1 Squadron during the Battle for France, wrote of the bravery of the daylight bomber squadrons. These battle and Blenheim boys of the AASF were the real heroes. They had none of the thrills of the fighters and twice the dangers. They knew every time they took off they didn't stand much chance of coming back, but they never shirked a job and never hesitated. We all admired and respected them, and it was our greatest sorrow that we were physically unable to protect them.
So then, of course, we were deep into what was called Operation Dynamo, and that was the invasion of the Low Countries by the Germans. And operational stuff we were doing was bombing ammunition dumps in the forests inside of Dunkirk. Bombing one specifically interesting one. There were guns at a place called Gravelines Point, which was mentioned in Nelsonian days, I noticed. They had the same gun emplacements in the same places, which was in the sand, dug out of the sand. So they were hindering the evacuation out of Dunkirk. So Blenheims were at Dunkirk, no doubt about that. And they had to be done. So 6 Blenheims went over from 107, 2 lots of 3, in line abreast, across the wave tops for supplies. And we certainly brought the gunners out in their pajamas, or nightgowns, I think the Germans wore in those days. They didn't show themselves, actually. We like to think they did, but we couldn't see them, you see, and we had to wait till we saw the spurts of flame, because they heard us coming. They had advance warning, I think, although we were at 0 feet. And we were all hit that day, but all got back, and 3 aircraft had to force land back at Waterloo, because the hydraulics had been shot out, punctured. And they forced landed because they couldn't get the undercarriage down, which worked from the hydraulic system.
After Dunkirk, the remnants of the light bomber squadrons returned to England, where they began to reform. When France fell in June 1940, Britain was faced with the threat of imminent invasion, and the Blenheim squadrons were given 2 new roles, both of which far exceeded their capabilities. But the aircraft was available in quantity, and in the absence of a better machine, there was nothing else to send. During the Battle of Britain, Blenheims were given the task of attacking the barges and other vessels building up in Channel ports in preparation for the invasion of England. Their second role was to hit the coastal airfields being used by the Luftwaffe to attack Britain. These missions were flown in daylight and usually at low level. In return for gains that were highly questionable, the losses were once again horrendous. On August the 13th, 82 Squadron was sent to attack the airfield at Aalborg in Denmark, and for the second time, 11 out of their 12 Blenheims were shot down. Meanwhile, Fighter Command's Blenheim Mark I's had been in action against the invading German bombers. On the night of July the 22nd, 1940, a Blenheim 1F of the Fighter Interception Unit at Tangmere shot down a Dornier DO-17 to score the first AI-assisted victory over the UK. Although it was the first type to carry the highly secret airborne interception equipment, the Blenheim lacked both the range and the firepower to become properly effective as a night fighter. By the winter of 1940, it was already being replaced by the Bristol Beaufighter, a faster and much more formidable machine. In January 1941, the RAF adopted a new offensive tactic and began to mount its first circus operations. With the aim of destroying as many German fighters as possible, Blenheim bombers were sent to attack selected targets in occupied Europe. Used as bait, they were escorted by an unprecedented number of fighters. On January the 10th, 6 Blenheims from 114 Squadron carried out the first circus when they attacked the German ammunition depot at Forêt-de-Guigne near Calais. The bombers were escorted by no less than 72 fighters. The results of these circuses were nowhere near as successful as the planners had hoped. Claims for the number of German fighters destroyed were grossly overestimated, and RAF losses were twice as heavy as the Luftwaffe's. In a single 6-week period during June and July, 123 RAF fighter pilots were listed as missing. On the 28th of April, 2 groups Blenheims commenced the first of the Channel Stop operations. As part of the RAF's mounting anti-shipping campaign, these raids were designed to prevent German convoys from using the Straits of Dover in daylight. But with the ships protected by fighter cover and an increased number of flagships, Blenheim losses were as heavy as ever. The opposition was ferocious, and when 3 Blenheims attacked a convoy off the coast of Holland, they were met with a barrage of fire from 8 flagships assigned to defend a single tanker. Despite poor results in terms of the number of vessels sunk, the Channel Stop raids continued well into the next year. In the summer of 1941, the Blenheims made 2 notable raids. On July the 4th, 12 aircraft from No. 2 Group attacked the port of Bremen in an ultra-low-level daylight raid. 105 Squadron, led by Wing Commander Huey Edwards, flew from Swanton Morley with little or no cloud cover. In the face of very heavy flak, 4 Blenheims were shot down, but the damage caused to Bremen was considerable. Flying V-6028 at chimney height, Edwards' machine was hit some 20 times as he pressed home the attack. Of the 8 surviving aircraft, his was the last to return home. 20 days later, on the 22nd of July, he was awarded Bomber Command's 3rd Victoria Cross for displaying outstanding courage, determination, and leadership during the operation. On August the 12th, 54 Blenheims from 2 Group took off on one of their most dangerous missions so far.
My outstanding memory of any Blenheim raid was one which took place on the 12th of August 1941, when 54 Blenheims were sent to attack the power stations of Cologne. This is the only deep penetration of Germany which I can recall in the Blenheim seas. They went to coastal targets. But my big memory of this is flying, hedge-hopping across Holland all the way, and the ecstatic reception we received from the farm workers in the fields as they saw the RAF roundels, and they waved like mad. And you then realize what the war was all about, because they had been occupied. And of course the waving stopped when we crossed the frontier. I didn't need my navigator to tell me when we had crossed from Holland into Germany. Well, we had no fighter escort, you see. Once we crossed the land, fight the Dutch coast, fighters came with us to the Dutch coast, had to turn back. They didn't have the range. We lost 12 of our Blenheims out of the 54 which took part in that raid. But to me, that was one of the outstanding raids against Germany or the mainland.
By the end of 1941, more modern aircraft were entering RAF service in the European theatre of operations. Fighter Command's Blenheims were largely replaced by the Bristol Beaufighter, while those of Bomber Command were finally being superseded by the Douglas Boston and de Havilland Mosquito. The last Bomber Command Blenheim operation of the war was an intruder raid on Osnabrück, flown by 18 Squadron on the 17th of August 1942. Overseas, the Blenheim saw service in both the Middle East and the Far East. When Italy declared war on Britain in June 1940, Middle East Command had a bomber force consisting of 14 squadrons, 9 of which were equipped with Blenheims. It was these machines which made the first raid on the new enemy when they attacked the Italian airfields. With the Italian invasion of Greece in October, 4 of these were detached to help the Greek army. At first, they were relatively successful, but when the Germans reinforced the Italians in April 1941, the Mark I Blenheims suffered heavy losses. On the 13th, 6 aircraft from 211 Squadron attacked the advancing German columns at Monastir Gap. Intercepted by Bf-109s, all 6 were shot down. Shortly afterwards, 113 Squadron lost every one of its Blenheims when the Luftwaffe raided its base at Neomata. Flight Lieutenant Stan Lee.
We were looking forward to getting back home again, back to our squadron in the UK. But at that time, we were sent across to Greece because the Italians had attacked Greece from Albania. The British government would offer Greece help, but Greece did not want trouble as far as the Germans were concerned. They didn't want to provoke them at all, and so they rejected all offers of help as far as the army was concerned, but they did welcome a Royal Air Force contribution. So a number of squadrons were sent over. I would say a number, I think it was 3 to begin with. And from 113 Squadron, my squadron, which was the only squadron at that time operating Blenheim 4s, long range, the long nose version. And we were sent across to Greece to do photographic reconnaissance work. We photographed German airfields, troop concentrators, etc., right up to the north into Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. It was all very clandestine because they didn't want to provoke the Germans in any way. And this continued until, I suppose it would be March, when the rest of the squadron came over and we went back to normal squadron duties. It was obvious then that the Germans were intending to invade Greece very shortly. We, after a few trips, we were at that time based in the Athens area, a place called Menidi, main airfield at Athens. It was quite exciting in a way because the Germans were in Athens in large numbers, lots of tourists, supplying information to their Italian allies. And we were warned not to antagonise them in any way. They didn't want any provocation at all, so we had to be very careful with our reconnaissance flights. But by the time the squadron came over, it was obvious the Germans were going to attack. We moved up north into, I suppose you'd call them the foothills of Mount Olympus, small grass airfield, which is really a bit of reclaimed land. And almost within days, the Germans attacked.
As the tattered RAF remnants withdrew to Egypt, 30 squadrons stayed behind on Crete, but was almost completely destroyed when the Germans invaded the island in May 1941. Since the start of the Desert War in North Africa, Blenheim squadrons had been supporting the British 8th Army by bombing the Axis troops as well as their airfields and equipment. In just 6 weeks, 13 and 18 squadrons alone lost 55 aircraft. On a ground support mission in November 1942, Wing Commander Hugh Malcolm was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross when all 12 Blenheims of 18 Squadron were shot down by Messerschmitt fighters. It was the second VC to go to a Blenheim pilot and marked the end of the Blenheim's daylight operations in the desert. The strategic key to disrupting supply lines to Rommel's Afrika Korps was the island base of Malta. More Blenheims were sent from 2 Group in England to carry out anti-shipping raids against the German supply convoys. Although their success rate was high, the cost in aircraft and crews was enormous. 107 Squadron alone suffered losses of over 90% in a single 12-week period. Sir Ivor Broom.
I found myself operating out of Malta with 105 Squadron, with Wing Commander Hughie Edwards again, was the CO, and it was in its last week in Malta. And I did 5 operations with them in that week, and then I was transferred to 107 Squadron as 105 Squadron came home. And I was a sergeant pilot at the time. 6 weeks later, we didn't have an officer left in the squadron. We were a bunch of sergeant pilots, and I was commissioned overnight and moved out to the sergeant's mess into the officer's mess. We were doing a tremendous lot of attacking, shipping of Rommel, ships going down with supplies to Rommel in North Africa. What might be interesting is that at Malta I did 1 night operation. There were ships in a Sicilian harbour with a big escort, and it was decided it would be suicide if we attacked them when they were left harbour in daylight. And so another crew and myself were detailed to do a low-level moonlight attack on these ships in a Sicilian harbour. My total night flying at the time was 8 hours. My previous night flying trip in the Blenheim had been at the Operation Conversion Unit about 6 months earlier. And so off we went in moonlight and we did attack these ships in that harbour. That was quite a thing to do that with it. We were sent because we were the most experienced crews, the other chap and myself. And I have many memories of raids out of Malta because of the importance of attacking the shipping going down to North Africa.
At the outbreak of war in the Far East, the RAF had 3 bomber squadrons and 1 fighter squadron equipped with Mark Is. When the Japanese invaded Malaya in December 1941, the Blenheims of 90 Squadron were the first to attack. The 3 squadrons based there were virtually wiped out before they could even get airborne. On the 9th of December, 60 Squadron were lining up for takeoff when Japanese fighters attacked their airfield at Alor Star. The first Blenheim managed to leave the ground, but the other 11 machines were completely destroyed. Piloted by Flight Lieutenant Scarf, the surviving aircraft carried out a successful solo mission, but by the time it returned to base, Scarf had been mortally wounded. The Blenheim's 3rd Victoria Cross was posthumously awarded to him on the 26th of June 1946. In addition to their operations in Malaya, the Far East Blenheim Squadron saw service in Singapore, Sumatra, Java, Burma, and India. As Singapore fell in 1942, the remaining units evacuated to Sumatra. In February, they attacked the Japanese invasion fleet off the Sumatran coast. Although they sank several ships, they were too few in number to prevent the Japanese from landing, and once again they withdrew, this time to Java. The pattern repeated itself, and in ever-decreasing numbers, the RAF began attacks on the invasion fleet moving towards Java. On the 1st of March, the Japanese landed, and within 24 hours, the surviving Blenheims of 84 Squadron had all been destroyed. Wherever they operated in the Far East, the Blenheims were usually heavily outnumbered and hopelessly outclassed by the Japanese aircraft. Against the Zeros, they were no match at all. By spring 1943, most of the Far East squadrons were converting to more advanced aircraft, and the Blenheim had largely retired from combat service overseas. Today, the Aircraft Restoration Company's Bristol Blenheim is the only airworthy example in the world. In the spring of 1993, WMZ took to the air again for the first time in decades. This is the second Blenheim to be completely restored by the ARC team. Pilot error caused the first machine to crash in June 1987, less than a month after completion of the rebuild. Both the aircraft and the 12 years of work that had gone into it were completely written off. Led by Graham Warner, the team began work on the second machine in January 1988. Much had been learnt from the first restoration, and this time they set themselves the target of 5 years. Starting with the remains of a Bolingbroke, WMZ was built in sections, with each section being restored separately before being mated to the main body of the aircraft. The restoration process is both laborious and painstaking. Each component has to be thoroughly stripped down, cleaned, and fatigue tested before it can be reused. Where the original parts are damaged or too badly deteriorated, replacements have to be manufactured or found from elsewhere. In many cases, the skin panels have to be made from scratch. The Bristol Mercury engines for WMZ were rebuilt using parts taken from a number of different units. Chief engineer and pilot for ARC is John Romain. Under his supervision, the project gradually progressed and eventually reached the stage where the engines were ready to be mounted onto the airframe.
The engines are Bristol Mercuries. They're a 9-cylinder radial engine. They have a half reduction on, so the propeller is actually turning at half engine speed. They produce, in the configuration we have them, 870 horsepower per engine. Wartime they went up to 950 horsepower. But we derate them slightly to keep their life as long as possible.
This aircraft was licensed built in Canada, where they set up a backup production in case the factories over here should be bombed, as indeed Filton here was bombed twice during the war, and it had been used for advanced training in Canada and then abandoned, literally abandoned at the side of a field, and was a complete derelict wreck. And we had it shipped over and stripped it right down, replaced most of the skins and formers and stringers and so on, and totally rebuilt. We stripped down 18 engines totally and rebuilt 2 good ones out of all the parts. And the first aircraft flew in May 1987. And unfortunately, it was totally destroyed in an accident within a few weeks. And so the team were literally at the base of Everest again, and they had to start all over again. And so this is the second Blenheim that we rebuilt, and it is still the only airworthy one in the world.
In April 1993, the machine was finally ready for engine testing and trials. Less than a month later came the christening ceremony and the first official flight. Watched by a large gathering of ex-Blenheim crews and specially invited guests, the present Viscount Rothermere gave the aircraft the appropriate name of Spirit of Britain First.
I should like to say how much indebted we are to Graham Warner for devoting such a tremendous effort to reproduce or recreate this wonderful aircraft, and to name it in tribute to my grandfather, the Spirit of Britain First, which was the name he gave to the first prototype of this aircraft, which was built to show that Britain could produce an aircraft which could outfly the planes at that time of the Luftwaffe, which my grandfather had seen in Germany, and which filled him with foreboding. I should also like to congratulate, say how wonderful it is to have Lady Violet Aitken here, for this plane is dressed in the colours of her late husband, Sir Max Aitken, who was a great war hero, and flew a plane in Blenheim like this one, and in whose memory it has been addressed and numbered with his aircraft number. Thank you. I name this aircraft the Spirit of Britain First.
We are proud to operate the aircraft. We do it as a tribute to the brave Blenheim boys who were absolutely in the thick of things right from the beginning of the war. And for 3 long years they were thrown into every possible role, attacking shipping, attacking airfields, the low-level multi-role combat aircraft, which now is filled by the Tornado. And the Blenheim really was a multi-role combat aircraft before that term was even thought of. And rather like the Tornadoes in the Gulf War, the Blenheims always had the difficult, sticky jobs to do and suffered accordingly. But we operate it as a tribute to the crews and in the spirit of Britain First, because whereas the original Blenheim boys were so loyal that they often sacrificed their own lives, the present team have worked very hard to put a Blenheim back into the air and to keep it there as a tribute to the wartime Blenheim crews.
Finished in the night fighter markings of 68 Squadron, she represents the aircraft flown by one of the RAF's most distinguished pilots, Wing Commander Max Aitken. The son of Lord Beaverbrook, he was credited with 8 enemy aircraft kills and became the only RAF pilot to fly operationally on both the first and last days of the war. When he took command of 68 Squadron after the Battle of Britain, he was given the task of carrying out the RAF's operational development of night fighting techniques. Rather than switch to the new Beaufighter, Aitken preferred to keep to his faithful Blenheim WMZ. When it was designed nearly 60 years ago, the Blenheim was, for a brief interlude, way ahead of its time. When the war came 4 years later, it was the exact opposite. Faced with machines that were vastly superior, its crews paid a very heavy price, and they did so time after time. But they carried on regardless, and by playing a major part in the early years of war, they bought the time needed to fill the gap in technology between the old and the new. As the last airworthy Blenheim in the world, WMZ symbolizes the astounding courage and determination of the Blenheim boys.
As far as I'm concerned, it was the greatest. It was, well, I don't know, I wouldn't have missed it for anything. And I don't know of many Blenheim people who would. I don't think you'll find many Blenheim people who say it was a cow of an aircraft, or whatever expression I like to use, because, I don't know, I think it was wonderful.
Oh, it was a beautiful machine to fly. You could turn on the sixpence with it. Lovely turning circle, which was very useful if you met any enemy aircraft. It was very good indeed.
It's been part of nearly half of my life now. Building 2 aeroplanes, this being the second. I love flying it, it's unique, it's the only one there is flying now in the world. And as a team we have a nice time, we enjoy operating it on the airshow circuit, and it's a nice machine to be with.